Kia ora koutou and welcome to the Getting On Board webinar. My name's Helen Bartle and I'm the Senior Advisor for Audience Development and Capability at Creative New Zealand.
Turn it down, please.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce the second Getting On Board webinar for 2015 on health and safety and the role of the board. Today's webinar will be led by Graham Narkis from Boardworks International, and it's a very topical subject judging by the number of you joining us today, and also in light of new legislation post-Pike River. It's great to see so many of our investment clients here and other organisations. Attendance at these webinars, just as a reminder, can be used as a credit for continuing professional development if any board members belong to professional bodies such as the Institute of Directors. For those of you who don't know Graham, he is the author of Getting On Board, a Creative New Zealand governance manual, and he's worked extensively with Creative New Zealand and the wider sector over many years to enhance governance capability. We will break for questions after each section, and we do apologise for the background noise, but we're currently just trying to work out how to put some of you on mute and some of, obviously, the presenter, Graham, not on mute, so we'll work through those issues. But if anyone does have any questions that they'd like to note, you can use the chat box on the left-hand side. Both the recording of this webinar and the PowerPoint presentation will be made available via Creative New Zealand's website, so don't feel that you have to make copious notes. So, Graham, over to you, if you can hear me.
I can hear you, Helen. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted by the amount of interest there is in the webinar today.
Sorry, I'm on a webinar. Thanks.
Sorry? Hello?
I just think you keep going, Graham. Sorry, we're just trying to sort out the background noise,
right.
But just keep
keep going. Great to have you all engaged in this exercise, because it's very much a learning journey for all of us. If I can just start by something I seldom do, which is a bit of a disclaimer, and it's simply because I want everyone to be very clear that we're going to be talking about what is actually draft legislation this morning. It's not been passed yet. There's still a wee bit of distance to go on that, but I think the broad bones of the new legislation and its obligations have become clear. The other thing I just want you to be sure of is that I'm not providing you with legal advice. You should independently, if you feel it's appropriate, take the appropriate advice from other professional advisors as well. The structure that I'm going to follow this morning is just to talk briefly about why this health and safety issue has suddenly become a hot topic from a governance perspective. I want to outline to you what is emerging out of the legislative development process. I've put quite a few slides in, rather more than I normally do, and that's for your information. I'm going to go quite rapidly over some of those slides because I'd like to spend some time on an interpretation of that in terms of what are the governance challenges and the processes that we might adopt in order to address the challenges that face us. As Helen also mentioned, there'll be a pause for questions after that description of the legislation before we start talking about governance challenges, and we'll leave some time towards the end as well for further discussion. I guess I should also, by way of a disclaimer, be an expert in health and safety. I think I'm in the same boat as everyone else, trying to get to grips with what it is that we need to address in this aspect of our governance performance. However, the starting point for our discussion really in that sense is, Helen, I've just lost the slides, I'm afraid. I will keep talking to them, but I'll get you to change them if that's possible. Is that
Yes, no
okay?
problem. Yep, I'll do that.
Okay, thank you. So New Zealand's got a terrible workplace record, and there's some stats there. I think, we would all acknowledge, even though there are particularly dangerous industries in New Zealand, even in our normal office-type working environments, there are health and safety challenges, and we need to start thinking about the role of governance in mitigating and managing those risks. Next slide, please, Helen. So the starting point for the present phase in the development of our interest in health and safety matters was the Pike River tragedy of 2010, when 29 men died in an underground coal mine, and that was a consequence of an ill-conceived and very poorly executed project. It was a disaster. It shook the nation and to some extent around the world. Interestingly, Pike River wasn't an ordinary mine. It had been touted by the company and government ministers as a showcase of modern mining. Shares in the company had been rapidly taken up by investors, and they were swept away really by predictions of extraordinary returns. Beneath that hype, though, there was a litany of mismanagement, mistakes, and what is sometimes called willful blindness, and I'll talk about that a wee bit more later on. You know, what's really surprising to me when I read Rebecca McPhee's book, and I would urge all of you who are interested in this subject to read that, because it's a primer on poor governance, particularly as it relates to health and safety, but also other aspects of board decision making. Notwithstanding the inherently dangerous nature of the project, neither the board nor the senior management of the Pike River Company, nor should it be said some of the miners themselves, really placed a great deal of weight on the health and safety risks involved. Would you switch the slide, please, Helen? So the Pike River disaster really led to the current development of legislation. The slide refers to it as the Health and Safety Reform Bill. When it's passed, it's going to be known as the Health and Safety at Work Act. The legislation really introduces some quite significant changes to our health and safety legislation. It's going to bring New Zealand's legislation into line with other countries. In particular, I think we're following Australia in that regard. It's going to reinforce that governors as well as managers have a really important obligation in relation to health and safety matters, and it's going to make those obligations a great deal more explicit and personal than has previously been the case. The post-election select committee, that's why there's been a further delay in the passage of the legislation. The new select committee has a report backdated the 29th of May, and then the bill will continue to progress through Parliament. It's not likely to be in effect until the second half of the year, but that's coming upon us quite rapidly. And in the meantime, I think we all have to try and get to grips with what our new responsibilities will be. Change the slide, please, Helen. The direction of travel in relation to the legislative changes that are being contemplated, really, I've tried to summarise them there. Much greater clarity about what directors, board members' responsibilities are. There is a significantly higher duty of care made explicit. There will be higher penalties, and I'll talk about those briefly shortly. And there will be, I think, almost certainly far more active enforcement of that legislation. And that all means to me that as boards and board members, we need to be more actively engaged in health and safety matters. Under the new Act, it's likely that there will be a duty to ensure health and safety across all workplaces and activities, and that means eliminating risks to health and safety as far as reasonably practicable, and if it's not reasonably practicable, to minimise those risks, again, so far as reasonably practical. And I'll talk about that in a moment. It's still going to be a case of balancing the nature and extent of particular risks against the costs and practicalities of protecting against the risk, but the balance is clearly going to be weighted heavily in favour of health and safety. I think we also need to be quite aware that accidents at work tend to be looked at in hindsight and with the wisdom of hindsight. When serious harm has occurred, cost will seldom justify a decision not to have done something that might have prevented the harm. So for costs to be relevant, they will need to be grossly disproportionate to the risk. Change the slide, please, Helen. So I referred to penalties before. There are a number of duty holders, and I'll explain what those are in a moment, but this slide refers to penalties for officers, and officers we can think of as board members. So there are three categories there, and as you will see, even at the lower level, the potential risks to individuals are quite significant, from $100,000 at the low level up to 5 years jail and or a very significant fine. So those fines and penalty levels are tiered based on who is the duty holder, and I'll explain those beginning now, really. And the next slide, please, Helen. The first of the terms we need to think about is that referred to as a PCBU. So a person conducting a business or an undertaking. PCBUs are in that pole position because they are considered to be in the best position to control risks to work health and safety. They're the ones carrying out the business or the undertaking and will have the primary duty of care under the new law. Despite its name, though, a PCBU will usually be a business entity, such as a company or an incorporated society, rather than an individual person. In the second part of that slide, it talks about the primary duty of care requiring all PCBUs to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers employed or engaged, and also the health and safety of other people. So that will be people coming onto your work sites, audiences and visitors to a gallery, for example. So the PCBU responsibility is very important. Take the next slide, please, Helen. Just breaking that down a wee bit more. The current legislation, which is the Health and Safety and Employment Act 1992, primarily focuses on employer and employee roles, but the PCBU concept replaces all of those duty holders. It better reflects the complex nature of modern workplaces, and we all know that there can be quite different parties with different working arrangements, all in the same location or working with the same organisation. So the PCB unit is a concept that recognises that a business or an undertaking has an influence over the health and safety of workers, even where those workers may not be your direct employees, so they might be contractors or suppliers of one sort or another. There is a proviso which I doubt will relate to many organisations that might be involved in this webinar, but it may involve some, so I'll refer to it. And that is that if your organisation is not a PCBU, if it is a volunteer association, and that a volunteer association is defined as an organisation that has a community purpose and has no employees. In other words, it's totally staffed by volunteers. And I'll talk about that perhaps a wee bit more shortly. Helen, next slide, please. And this refers to the PCBU's specific obligations. So there's a list of those there. I won't go through them other than just to generally observe that they're very comprehensive, and they cover not only facilities but also providing information and training, and not just as a one-off action or activity, but something which is continuing, which requires the active monitoring of health and workplace conditions. Next slide, please, Helen. We also need to think about a concept which has been referred to as the upstream PCBUs. And when we talk about that concept, we mean PCBUs who are upstream from the workplace. It might be designers, architects, engineers, suppliers to your organisations, installers of equipment, for example, suppliers of structures that you use. They also have a role to play in managing the risks to health and safety at your workplace. And they also have a duty to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, that the work they do or the things they provide to the workplace don't create health and safety risks. I guess you'll need to think about what that means in the context of your organisations and activities. But, for example, it might mean that sculptors who produce structures, for example, off-site and then bring them into a gallery have a responsibility to those who work in the gallery or visit the gallery. Next slide, please, Helen. And that brings us to probably the most significant thing in terms of today's webinar, and that is to consider what the new obligations are in relation to board members. And a new duty is proposed by the bill applying to someone who is an officer of a PCBU, such as a director, board member, or in a partnership, a partner, for example. And officers must ensure that a PCBU complies with its duties. And that means that people at the governance level of an organisation must actively engage in health and safety matters. Now, the previous law perhaps is not as clear as it might be on that, but certainly that's going to change quite significantly. So this is a provision that acknowledges that a business or an undertaking is governed by individuals who, through their decision-making, influence the specific activities that in turn ensure the success or failure of health and safety initiatives, and whether or not the PCBU is complying with its own duty of care. So, for instance, boards make important decisions on the resources that are available for work health and safety, and in terms of policy making in relation to supporting the PCBU to comply with this legislation. Next slide, please, Helen. So let's look at the responsibilities of officers, and I must admit to finding the current provision slightly confusing myself, but I suppose the main point here is that the officer's duty is not the same as the PCBU's duty, duty of care that is. Obviously the PCBU is more directly in the firing line here. So officers, as the legislation is currently drafted, do not have to ensure the health and safety of the PCBU's workers, but officers must exercise what's referred to in the legislation as due diligence to ensure that the PCBU is meeting its health and safety obligations. So those due diligence duties complement and support the primary duty of care of PCBU, but does not replace it. Next slide, please. There's the category I referred to before, the proviso for voluntary organisations. So we can also think of volunteer officers, and as I said before, they're exempt, provided they are simply volunteers and the organisation does not employ anyone. Volunteer officers have a duty to exercise due diligence, just like everyone else, but they won't be personally liable under the Act if they breach that duty. So there are also the potential for different standards applying within the board. So, for example, if you are a chair who receives payment that's not simply an allowance, and I'm aware of organisations where chairs may, for example, in recognition of the additional work that they do, be required, or not required, but they will receive, say, an honorarium or something like that, which reimburses them for the additional time that they might spend. If they are the only person that receives that sort of payment, then they will have a liability which is greater than their fellow board members who are simply volunteers who are not remunerated. So that may lead you to think about some of those remuneration type situations. Some of you who are trustees in, say, community trusts or something like that will already be familiar with those sorts of different duties, albeit a wee bit different in the Trustees Amendment Act. But there, if you're a board member, for example, who's an investment professional, you will likely be held to a higher standard than your fellow board members. Next slide, please, Helen. Now, that's quite a useful little flow chart, which I've included. It's out of one of the MB publications, just to help you figure out whether those legal obligations apply to your organisations or not. Next slide, please, Helen. So I want to spend some time on this issue of due diligence. We talk about due diligence in other governance contexts. It's the sort of thing that anyone should do if they are joining a new board, the board of an organisation that they're not familiar with, to really find out what makes it tick, maybe what the risks are in taking on the responsibilities of a board member and that type of thing. Well, we're talking about due diligence here in the generic sense that it is actively seeking out information about the situation that you're dealing with. And so in terms of the draft legislation, due diligence means that officers have to take, and I would argue have to be able to demonstrate that they've taken reasonable steps. For example, to know about work health and safety matters generally, and I guess that's the process that we're involved in this morning, trying to understand how the legislation might relate to us. It means, and this is a very proactive responsibility, I think, gaining an understanding of the operations of the organisation and the hazards and risks generally associated with those operations. In the second part of the webinar, we will talk about the steps and the processes that you might take in relation to that. You also have to ensure that the PCBU has appropriate resources and processes to eliminate or minimise those risks, and that you get good reporting on the incidents that occur in the organisation and any changes to the health and safety risks that the organisation faces. And you have to demonstrate again, I think, that you are responding to that information. In other words, once you have advice or information that suggests there is a risk, if you don't act on that, you may well find yourselves in trouble. It's also about ensuring that there are processes in place to comply with duties under the legislation and those are implemented. And there's also a verification role. Make sure that the resources and processes that you may have approved, allocated, budgeted for, and the policies that you have created, they're actually being applied. Next slide, please. So there's one other category of duty holder, and that is the individuals in the workplace. And this includes volunteers as well as employees. They also have a responsibility to take reasonable care to ensure that their own health and safety while at work is assured. And must also ensure that his or her acts or omissions in the workplace do not adversely affect the health and safety of other persons. And certainly some lessons from the Pike River tragedy in relation to that. In a sense, the miners were complicit in increasing the risks that they faced. A worker must also comply as far as reasonably able with any reasonable instruction given by the PCBU, which would allow the PCBU to comply with their responsibilities under the Act. Helen, next slide, please. I said that I would also just refer briefly to this phrase that I have referred to a number of times, which is about reasonably practical. So this is what the bill steers us towards at the moment. It's a very important concept, and it's, while PCBUs must do what is reasonably practicable, obviously the board's own decisions will impact on that judgment about what is reasonably practicable. So you should think about how your board's actions and the signals that it sends impact the judgment of management on the extent of the risk and the available ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, and how the costs relative to the risk are weighed up, and whether the cost is judged to be grossly disproportionate to the risk. Bearing in mind, as I said earlier, that judgment about these matters is always after the fact, and if there has been harm, particularly loss of life, then costs will become relatively minor in the equation, even if you felt at the time that they were very high. So Helen, I'm going to pause there and invite questions. Just realise that I haven't got a screen, so I cannot tell you, I cannot read what people's written questions might be, so you'll need to verbalise them for me.
Yeah, sure. So we do have a question from Suzanne Smith, and she wants to know, do employees include independent contractors?
I don't believe that they do. I believe that well, they have obligations in terms of themselves being PCBUs or employees of PCBUs. There may be some lawyers on the line that can add further to that, but I think that the gist of or the intent, I suspect, of the question is, should contractors be expected to adopt the same obligations that employees have in terms of responsibility for taking their own responsibility for health and safety of themselves on a workplace? I think a common sense answer to that would be yes.
Does anyone else have a question at this stage that they want to ask Graham? No?
Okay, well, shall we proceed?
I think we should continue on then, yeah. Oh, there seems to be I think there may be a new chat. Hang on a minute. Yeah, it was just a general one. So the slides will be available. We'll be posting them on our website afterwards. Coralie Wynne wanted to know. So, yeah, they'll be posted in about a week's time. Okay, so look, I apologise for sort of having a fairly quick romp through what's quite a complex piece of legislation. When we finish, I will also give you some reference to some resources where you can read about this stuff, particularly as it relates to directors and board members' responsibilities, and hopefully you can follow up on those as well as the material from the webinar. So Helen, let's go on to the next slide. So I want to talk for the second part of the webinar about the implications for what boards and board members must do. And I've divided that into 4 or 5 different types of activities, starting with what I've referred to as continuing education. I think it's really important that boards and the staff that support boards keep up to date, not only with this emerging legislation, but also what is bound to be, in the first few years at least, quite a lot of interpretive material around that legislation, perhaps the outcome of prosecutions that might occur under the new legislation. There's bound to be a continuing stream of advisory publications from the likes of WorkSafe. For those of you who are not aware of it, another thing that's emerged out of Pike River is the formation of a new organisation which is called WorkSafe. Previously, health and safety lay within the Department of Labour. The Department of Labour was then absorbed into the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, known as MB. So there's been a structure there, and you would do well to become familiar with the material. It's on the WorkSafe website because it's very helpful and it's tracking the progress of the legislation at the moment. In terms of keeping up to date, you might have someone. Some boards, for example, have committees that may be relevant to this. It may be, for example, an audit and risk committee.
In other cases, some boards have given each board member, say, a portfolio, a responsibility that they particularly take responsibility for overseeing. So it may be very useful to have someone, if not a committee, certainly an individual, either on the board or not on the board. So it might be a board secretary, for example, that might do that as well. But to just keep track of all that material so far as possible, the changes in the legislation, the outcome of prosecutions, as I said, changing perceptions of risk in the community, and those advisory publications I referred to. So another way that the board might keep on top of this is to review case studies. Again, there's within the literature around this, either out of WorkSafe or also a very useful publication, which I'll give you a reference to later on, that was jointly published by MB and the Institute of Directors, included a number of case studies about how the legislation might apply in different circumstances. So review case studies, use those as discussion topics around the board table, or perhaps even create your own scenarios, thinking about your own health and safety risks. You know, the sort of what-if questions which enable a board to work through in a sort of a test case manner to ensure that it's thinking about what possible things may occur in the organisation. I suggest that it's worthwhile having those sort of conversations, not just the board alone, but also with staff and volunteers, if those are also relevant to your organisation. The second thing, in terms of continuing education, and I can't stress this enough, is you must go and see for yourself. So, for example, just referring to one organisation, Television New Zealand, for example, they've had their board regularly taking trips through TV studios, for example, to see the sort of hazards that occur even in that type of environment. I chair a Polytechnic Council. Before every board meeting now, we have a health and safety site visit. We go to a different part of a different campus and look at the health and safety risks. We quiz the supervisory staff, the tutors, and their superiors, the deans and so forth. We talk to students where we can. What we're trying to do is actively understand not only what the risks are, but even more importantly, how staff, what their attitude is to managing those. Because that's a part of our risk. If there was a slack attitude, for example, to health and safety, then you would want to be quite concerned, because those are the frontliners that are actually managing your risks for you as officers. There are a lot of other benefits I'm finding from those walkarounds. To make the board more visible to staff, and also vice versa. So we've met a lot of staff that we had never met before, and that's been beneficial in a general sense. We're demonstrating by taking that step and doing it on a regular basis that we actually care, and that the policies that we make are real and not just empty rhetoric. As I say, we're checking the attitudes towards health and safety. We're particularly keen to understand, for example, what sort of induction new staff get, what sort of induction students get, because, you know, in many cases, tutors are dealing with teenagers, some of whom are still at school. So they're doing some school work and some polytechnic work. And we all know, that teenagers' brains aren't fully developed, and they have a different attitude to health and safety that maybe others might have. And so you're also looking for the evidence that health and safety risks have been identified and that they're being actively managed. I think in preparation for those sorts of site visits, you would do well to study closely the sort of diagnostic questions that have been published for directors. So I've got in front of me a circular that was put out by the Institute of Directors, but the same material exists in some of the WorkSafe and MB publications. And there's a whole page of what they've referred to as diagnostic questions, which are the sort of questions that boards should be asking, whether of other people or of themselves. So I would commend that you do that. And the other thing that I suggest that you do in relation to these walkabouts is not just go out there and do that, but when you come back to your boardrooms, that you debrief on that and that you have some sort of record of the observations that you make and any follow-up action that might be required. It's like a lot of risk management. I think that to the extent that a board is able to concretely demonstrate and have a paper trail to prove it, that it is fulfilling not only in a compliance sense its duties, but in a genuine sense it is really doing its job in terms of providing a safe and healthy workplace. Change the slide, please, Helen. So I referred in my earlier remarks to the concept of willful blindness, and this was certainly present in the Pike River situation. I'd just like to, again, it's in the context of continuing education, and it's perhaps more generic because it applies to other decisions that you may or may not make as well, is to actually think about this concept of willful blindness. And I've used a cover shot of a book written by an English person called Margaret Heffernan. I commend that book to you heartily, and if you haven't got time to read the book, perhaps go and have a look at one of her presentations on YouTube. But clearly willful blindness was at play at Pike River, and it's actually, I've discovered subsequently, besides being a psychological phenomenon, it's actually a legal concept. So you are legally responsible as a director if you could have known and should have known something which instead you strove not to see. There's an opportunity for knowledge and a responsibility to be informed, but willful blindness occurs where both of those, the opportunity to know something and a responsibility to do something about it, both of those responsibilities and opportunities are shirked. So whether it's individual or collective, willful blindness doesn't have a single driver. It's a human phenomenon, and I guess we all succumb to it in one way or another. That saying about love being blind. In our infatuation, we ignore all sorts of things that maybe come back to haunt us later on in terms of our partner's flaws and frailties. Ideology in many fields masks what to the uncaptivated mind is obvious, dangerous or absurd. And the fear of conflict and change also makes us blind to matters or facts which are inconvenient and that we don't want to confront. We have to deal with the fact that we can't notice and know everything. We have cognitive limits to our brains, and as a consequence we filter or edit the information that we take in. The problem is we mostly allow in the information that makes us feel good and does our egos good, and we conveniently filter out stuff that unsettles us or confronts our most vital beliefs. However, the point of talking to you about this is just to reinforce that directors have a duty to be informed about matters that are important. And in this case, it's about a range of realities and potential risks that affect health and safety of those who serve your organisation. Next slide, please, Helen. So another really important activity here, and I've talked about this in previous webinars, is the board's policy-making role. And I think in this area particularly because the board is physically separated apart from those sorts of initiatives that I've referred to from the frontline health and safety matters on a day-to-day basis. The board needs to be able to influence those remotely, and it does this through creating an appropriate policy framework. So you should check the policy framework you currently have and how that might apply to managing and mitigating these health and safety risks. You need to spell out the board's role and responsibility for health and safety, and this should be included in your board charter or your governance policy manual. I think in terms of the board's general approach to risk, you should probably up the ante on health and safety, and I would say check your risk registers. When this started to become more of an issue in the boards that I'm directly involved with, either the boards that I'm on or that I work with as a consultant, I think many of us have found that our traditional risk registers have been quite light on health and safety because boards have been seen or seen themselves as a little bit remote from that. So check that. And your policy framework should explicitly set out the board's health and safety expectations and make sure that those are embodied in appropriate policy. And remembering that the governance policy really has two key elements or dimensions to it. First is, what are the results that we want to be achieved? And that's high-level strategy, arguably, but also in a more practical risk management sense, what are the situations and circumstances that we expect those that account to us to avoid? Next slide, please, Helen. The next activity for me that's really important is aligning your strategic planning and your resource allocation with the risks that you identify in the health and safety space. So be really careful to check whether the potential organisational rewards that you are seeking cause you, in your enthusiasm and your passion, to neglect the downside of your optimism. And in most major corporate collapses, and certainly this was the case at Pike River, the pursuit of a reward of some sort is often sufficient to diminish the sense of what could go wrong and the risks that need to be managed. So that applies to other elements of your governance responsibility as well. Are performance pressures or performance incentives creating perverse incentives? So it's not strictly relevant to this context, but one of the most widely studied corporate collapses was of, firstly, if you go back 10 or 15 years, a company called Enron in the United States, where the incentives that were provided to management and directors were such that they really neglected their responsibilities to manage risk and to manage their duty or deliver their duty of care to other stakeholders. In the finance sector collapses of more recent times, we saw the same sorts of things. People were incentivized to take excessive risk. So look for any of those sorts of things that might exist in your organisation. And the third thing on that slide, because it's emphasised in the legislation too, is that you should be very careful to think through whether the board, to the extent that's involved in the budgeting process, is making sure that sufficient resource, financial resource in that case, is being allocated to health and safety risk management. So, for example, where there is equipment being used, is it safe and up to date? Does it meet industry standards? Would it pass muster if, as a result of its failure, you had the WorkSafe inspectors coming and visiting and asking themselves whether they needed to start prosecuting you or not? Next slide, please, Helen. I referred earlier to the need for a board to be active in its monitoring process. Don't just rely on the fact that you've made a decision, you've allocated resources, you've adopted a policy. Check for compliance. Check that things are actually happening. And I think I may have spoken in previous webinars about the responsibility of a board to ideally be as empowering as possible and to implicitly trust those that work for it, but to verify. And a lot of our audit processes are about that verification process. And it's ultimately about holding management who are effectively the PCBU in this context, hold them to account for the various aspects that are needed to manage risk. And when you're doing this, don't forget that systems, for example, are really important. You are not responsible just for employees, but for volunteers, for contractors, for visitors, and the others that may come into physical contact with your organisation. In respect of contractors, because that was a point that was raised before, I think it's important that you probably go so far as to ensure that the contractors that are used in an organisation bring health and safety attitudes and standards that match your own. So that's another area of checking and verification that you probably need to go through. In terms of management reporting to a board on health and safety matters, this should now, if it's not already, be a regular part of your monthly or however often your board meets, the management reporting that comes to the board. And this should involve analysis, not just a data dump. It's an area where I think a lot of boards are still working on, is to get reporting that informs them as well as just tick some sort of compliance box. Make sure that action is being taken and that is thoughtful action, not just compliance action. We don't want a tick box approach to this because that will inevitably fail. I think it's also important to try and encourage the development of a culture in the organisation which is sometimes referred to as a learning culture. And I would contrast learning cultures with judging cultures. And this is very important in terms of the tone that's set by the board. A number of years ago, I was a chief executive in the health sector, and I had a constant battle with my board at the time because one of the key reports that we had to lodge with the Ministry of Health was the data on incident reporting. Incidents being where something had gone wrong, the wrong leg amputated, or that's very extreme obviously, the wrong drug administered, or a patient falling out of bed, or somebody tripping over a loose impediment in the corridor, or just harm coming to a patient which shouldn't have occurred. And when those incident reports came to the board through my reporting to them, if the number of incidents being reported had gone up, they saw that as a black mark. I saw it completely differently. I saw that as a very positive indication that staff were active and honest in reporting incidents because incidents are learning opportunities. So be very thoughtful about the sort of culture that you're creating as you monitor management performance in relation to health and safety. And provide feedback. In other words, recognise that you need to encourage or discourage, as the case may be, as part of that feedback loop that comes from a board to management. And at the end of the day, you're all in this together. It's no longer sufficient to say, if it ever was, that, oh, well, management stuffed that up, or an employee, transgressed a policy. I'm involved with an organisation that's currently facing a potentially quite major prosecution under the current health and safety legislation because an employee did something that was specifically excluded by policy and as a result created an accident that harmed only himself, but nevertheless the organisation is being held accountable for that, because even though we had policy in place, the event still occurred. It's still being defended, so I don't know what the outcome of that's likely to be, but I think it's a salutary lesson. Okay, Helen, would you change the slide, please? That was all I was going to say in a general sense about the sorts of legislation that's emerging and the sort of steps we might take as boards and as board members to address the challenges that are in that legislation. But I want to just acknowledge some resources that you might want to follow up on. So on that slide, you'll see a web address which is to the ongoing information download from the government agency responsible for overseeing the passage of the legislation. So that'll give you a good sense of where things are at. There's also a great wealth of explanatory material on there about some of the concepts that I referred to this morning and about some of the steps that the different duty holders should take to manage those risks. I referred earlier to the IOD publication, which is called Good Governance Practices, Guidelines for Managing Health and Safety Risks. That is to some degree a little bit out of date now because it was prepared before the new legislation was introduced to the House, I think. But there's still a lot of really useful material in there, including the diagnostic questions I referred to earlier. It would be remiss of me if I didn't, next slide please Helen, if I didn't also refer to two key publications by Creative New Zealand. One of them Helen referred to in her introduction, which is the document that I helped put together, which is called Getting on Board. But there's also Creative New Zealand's Risk Management Toolkit. And that will give you, it does give you a really good conceptual framework for managing risk in a generic sense, and you should apply some of the disciplines there to thinking about health and safety as well. So I want to conclude now my presentation, and it's got 5 minutes or so for questions. But I just wanted to conclude with a quote from the Royal Commission on the Pike River coal mine tragedy. And the conclusion, the piece that I've chosen, that the Royal Commission said, the board and directors are best placed to ensure that the company effectively manages health and safety. They should provide the necessary leadership and are responsible for the major decisions that must influence health and safety. And the Royal Commission referred to the strategic direction, the securing and allocating of resources, and ensuring that the company or the organisation has appropriate people, systems and equipment. And I think that is a quote that you might want to come back to fairly regularly as your board addresses these challenges. So thank you for your attention. I'm very happy to answer further questions.
Thank you, Graham. Before I ask generally if anyone has any questions, we did have a question from Tanya from Dance, and she said she's very interested in this topic from the point of view of obviously the dance sector. She's saying that dance is hugely participatory and there are not currently any nationally recognised teacher qualifications. So we do not have consistency on what is taught and how it is taught to the participants of any age and background, and there are dance codes of practice but not codes of practice for each genre. Many of the social dance forms do not have consistent training programs, and consequently injuries in dance are growing as the dance continues to grow. So I think she's interested to perhaps get your perspective specifically on dance, if you have any observations to make.
Look, I think the most obvious observation from my perspective is that there appears from Tanya's comments that there is a huge need for some sort of industry-wide initiative around, even if it's not about consistency and training and that sort of thing, at least to develop a collective understanding of the impact of different training methods, etc., different genres, you say, on dancer welfare, because I would think that if injuries are growing, that is completely in the wrong direction, and it's signalling that liabilities under this new legislation will come very much into focus here, because this is information that Tanya and others in the dance community obviously have. And I talked about willful blindness before, and I'm sure there is none of that in this case, but nevertheless, that the information that dancers are at risk and that training methods, etc., may be adding to that risk is something that the boards of those dance companies cannot afford to ignore.
Thank you. And we have one from Stephanie Rolfe. She has said, going back to the first section on the new Act, she's interested in the concept of upstream accountability. The organisation that she's part of is often hired by other organisations, and she's interested in your thoughts about how this could play out in terms of relative accountability in these circumstances.
Thank you. It's interesting to think through some of those relationships, both in terms of who are our upstream suppliers and are we ourselves supplying downstream, so to speak. And in that latter case, I think it's something that that supplying organisation, that contracting organisation, has its own direct responsibilities as a PCBU and with its own officers, etc. So it has to attend to its own health and safety risks. But I would think that there's an opportunity here to be very proactive in communicating with those that you are providing services to, and being active in not waiting to be asked what your health and safety attitude and approach is, but to offer that as part of the way you engage with that organisation and proactively try to make sure that there is alignment. Because in a sense, what you are doing is sending your own employees or volunteers into somebody else's workplace, and you don't want to put them in harm's way in that context either. So it's very much, whether it's upstream or downstream, the obligations are pretty much the same.
Great. Thanks, Graham. Well, we're just on the hour of 10 o'clock, so I would like to just say a special thank you to you, Graham, for a really excellent and incredibly informative session today. And my thanks to all of you for being a part of it. We hope that you're able to put this material to good use in the boardroom. The next Getting on Board webinar will be taking place on Tuesday, the 22nd of September, and the topic will be on board dynamics. Very interesting. There was actually, I think, a new section in the Getting on Board manual, or certainly an updated section. So we're going to be looking at a particular challenge in governing any organisation which is actually conducting board meetings, and actually understanding how group dynamics play out in that regard. And what collective and individual behaviours actually help and hinder board performance. So we'll send you more information nearer the time. We hope you can join us. And again, many thanks, Graham. And if anyone does have a further question for Graham, feel free to email myself or Cassandra, and we'll gladly forward that on to Graham today. And thanks for your feedback too. Ka kite anō.